freedom or death. That was the rallying cry of the largest slave rebellion in the U.S. more than 200 years ago. This week, hundreds of people brought it back to life during a powerful reenactment. I'm Malika Bilal, and you're in the stream. Join us on Twitter or in our live YouTube chat to talk about the lessons learned from the resistance. In 1811, some 500 slaves marched for 2 days in an effort to take over New Orleans and declare a free republic. Their attempt was reenacted this week by participants dressed in period costumes. Armed with weapons, they beat drums and chanted for their rights as they walked past the oil refineries and trailer parks that replaced the sugar plantations of the 19th century. The event was the brainchild of performance artist Dred Scott. He came up with an alternate ending to the march, a celebration instead of a massacre. He briefly spoke to the stream about how he hopes the reenactment will help empower people.
A, this was a project about freedom and emancipation. B, that it is something that really celebrates an important point in American history. This 1811 revolt should be much more known, and the rebels were heroes. And I also want people to think about how this past connects to the present, not just the past of slavery, but actually the past of freedom fighters, people fighting to get free from oppression and exploitation. And what does that say for us today? How do people walk in the shoes of those rebels and come up with radical solutions to the problems we confront right now?
Joining us to discuss from New Orleans, Louisiana, KAIA Livers. She is the head of community outreach for the Slave Rebellion reenactment. IBRAHIMA SECK is director of research at the Whitney Plantation in Louisiana. It's the only plantation museum in the region that focuses on slavery. And Andrew Rakich is a filmmaker for Atunche Films. He produced a documentary about the 1811 slave rebellion earlier this year. Welcome all of you to the stream. Now, you all attended the reenactment last week, some as participants, some as spectators, but I want to pick your brains on what it was like. But first, this from people online using the hashtag Slave Rebellion Reenactment to share pictures and videos of what that was like. This from Eric Johnson. Have a listen there. They're chanting on to New Orleans. We're going to end slavery, freedom or death, and join us. KAIA, when did you learn about the 1811 rebellion?
Well, I discovered a paragraph in a book in the mid-90s that just the topic was the largest slave rebellion in U.S. history, and it turned out to be Louisiana. I was filled with so much pride at that moment. And then it took a couple of more years before anything was really published about the event. And by the end of the 90s, I had created a production with kids to tell the story.
Filled with pride because that's your hometown. And so you're saying this was not too long ago that you found out about it. Why do you think that is? Why do you think you didn't learn this history growing up?
Well, this history is suppressed. I mean, even today, up until this event, it was difficult to talk about. Nobody wanted to talk about it. Everyone wanted to keep it in the closet or suppressed because it's very painful to talk about slavery. But we have to have those conversations.
So I want to share here a map. IBRAHIMA, you shared this with our producers ahead of the show. New Orleans and the German Coast, 1811. Talk to us about what we're seeing on this map and what it represents.
Yeah, on this map, this is from a book by one of the two authors who wrote about the rebellion. His name is Dan Rasmussen. And you see on the left, on the other side of the river, the Manuel Andres plantation. That's where the rebellion started. And then they moved downriver to capture New Orleans. And they were stopped. You see the last plantation before New Orleans where they stopped, that's for the Fortier plantation. That's where the Bonnet-Carré Spillway is today. The Bonnet-Carré Spillway is some kind of infrastructure that allowed to take the overflow of the river into Lake Pontchartrain. But most of the fight happened also here on, when you go back, they retreated upriver to Bernard Bernoulli's plantation. And after they were defeated, most of them were taken to trial on the Jean-Noël Destréhan plantation. And that plantation is still standing.
And the interesting thing about the Kenner
river.
and Henderson plantation, IBRAHIMA, is as I'm sure you know, that's where the airport stands today. And that was where one of the initial skirmishes happened.
Absolutely.
When the American militia that was in the city tried to face off against these slave rebels. Now, at that time, of course, the slave rebels were about 500 strong, and the Americans could only scrape together 100 men from the city. So it was not very hopeful for the powers that be and for the plantation class. So next time, folks, when you're flying into the New Orleans airport, just keep in mind that this is where that first skirmish went down.
That is incredible. Andrew, what do we know about how this got started, how the plot to rebel formed?
Oh, man, it's an amazing story. I mean, Charles Deslandes, the leader of the rebellion, and this was all his kind of brainchild, right? He was, as far as I'm concerned, like the William Wallace of the American South. And his story was just incredible. He was incredibly clever and incredibly resourceful. And yeah, he was a mixed-race slave driver on the Woodland plantation owned by, as IBRAHIMA said, Manuel Andre, his master. And as such, he had special privileges. And he was seen by his fellow slaves as Manuel Andre's lapdog, essentially, his right-hand man. And he would ask his master, hey, master, can I go to the Trepanier estate to visit my girlfriend? And his master would say, oh, yeah, go ahead. It's fine. Spend the night. And Deslandes would spend the night going around to different plantations, stirring stuff up and trying to get these more rebels to his cause. And he did this for months.
And I think it went on more than just months. I believe it went on for years, because we're talking about a time period where there's no social media, no telephone communications. In order for him to be able to move about during 2 different plantations, he had to really build up a respectable reputation with his his enslaver. So he was very smart, and one of the things I believe he did was maintain the stories that had been brought from the Haitian Revolution until
that definitely inspired him for sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure that's probably when the idea started.
IBRAHIMA, you were trying to say?
Yeah, the Haitian Revolution was an inspiration for them. But Charles Deslandes was born right there by the Manuel Andre plantation, and let's remember also the Maroons, who played a very important role in communication.
And Maroons, for those of our audience who's not familiar with that history, the Maroons are slaves or people who tried to run away from being enslaved and from slavery and went where? Yeah,
people who ran away from the plantation, and they went to hide into the swamp. And at night, they would move from plantation to plantation to look for food, to meet their people, and also to convey information. And you can see it in the archives of Louisiana, especially St. John the Baptist Parish, St. Charles Parish. There were so many Maroons out there in the woods, in the swamp, and Charles Deslandes was able to build up all of those people available. And let's not forget also, let's remember also the domestics. Maybe they had privileges with better food, better cloth, but that played a very important role in the dissemination of information coming from the big house, from the masters to the slave quarters.
So KAIA, I want to share another picture from people because they're so striking seeing these images here. Anasa Hicks tweet this. They hear #slave rebellion reenactment, and you can see just one picture, a depiction of what was going on last week. This took about 6 years, right? From idea to fruition. Why did it take so long? What was happening in that process?
Well, research was happening, but also funding. Funding was very important, and we started this project during the Obama years, and then we shifted into a Republican president, and Republicans are not friendly to the arts.
So how did you come over that hurdle? What happened? How did it happen?
Well, it happened because Dred Scott was persistent, and he was determined to have this project and have this event happen. So I don't know all of the details of what he did to raise funds, but I know he spent 5 years, even up until a month or 2 weeks before the event occurred. He was still talking to people who could possibly donate or provide some funding resource to us.
And I think it's something that is much appreciated by at least the people that we're talking to, people in our community and people who have spoken to us about what it meant to them. I want to play a video comment from one of those people. She's a writer and a historian. Her name is Allison Bing. And here's what she told the stream.
This is an important American work of art. Too often, U.S. history is explained as a series of conquests, of battles fought and land taken. This leads Americans to believe we have one choice: conquer or be conquered. That's a depressing prospect. But we also have a tradition of resistance against impossible odds. The German Coast Slave Uprising proves that. Dred Scott's reenactment reminds us that resistance is a hard-won inheritance. And it also might be the through line in American history.
Ibrahima, she mentions we have a history and a tradition of resistance against impossible odds. Do you think that that is something that people think of when they think of slavery? Do they think of the resistance?
Yeah, oftentimes people don't think about resistance. Someone said, well, maybe last year, that 400 years of slavery for Black people must have been a choice. But not knowing really what was going on during slavery time, people fought against slavery all the time. From the time they were brought over here from Africa, and even starting in Africa, it was always about resisting, and you don't even know how many uprisings were plotted and that were not executed. You know, this is one of the few that came into execution. But slavery went all the way with resistance. People resisted from the beginning to the end.
Yeah, and this should be taught more. I mean, like the person in the clip said, what's more American than resisting against impossible odds? But this very highly American story, you know, you can make comparisons to the Revolutionary War and all of these American struggles for freedom, right, is, as Dred Scott said, virtually unknown. And I think
one
largely
of the things,
that's because it just doesn't fit into the narrative of how we as Americans like to see ourselves. You know what I mean?
One of the reasons I took so much pride when I first saw the paragraph about Louisiana taking a stand was I know we have a very strong civil rights history, but to know that we had went as far back as 1811 and took a stand. And the thing about it was that they didn't just run away. They organized themselves. They organized to take over the government and to make a place for themselves in America, because they could have easily just ran away and lived in the swamps and the woods and just scattered. Most of them probably would have survived if they just would have done that, but they were making a major statement. And
they almost won too. They almost succeeded. It was really just through kind of bad luck and one or two sort of little circumstances. I mean, if Deslandes had been successful in killing Manuel Andre, his master, instead Andre escaped in the middle of the night, getting stabbed multiple times, and he saw his son killed in front of him, and he was bleeding, and he ran to a rickety canoe moored in the river by the levee, and he was able to row across the river, bleeding profusely, and finally got to a buddy's house on the west bank of the river, Charles Perret's house, and was able to raise that militia, which then 2 days later went back across the river and hit the slave army in the rear, which was what eventually kind of caused their downfall.
But Andrew, that is vivid and very clear and concise the way that you just put that across. And yet I've never heard that before. Growing up here in the U.S., in the education that I had, which I like to think was quite good, never heard that description. And actually don't even know if I learned about this rebellion. I know I'm not the only one, though, unfortunately. And I want to bring in a comment from someone watching on YouTube. Elizabeth Rainey, watching live, says, whoever controls the past controls the future. If we don't teach Black kids, or I would add in any kids, American kids, about these moments of resistance, they won't be inspired to fight for a better future. So her comment is juxtaposed with the comment of someone who was referenced a little bit earlier. Ibrahima, you referenced this. I want to play it for our audience. It talks about this myth, the myth that slaves were complicit and complacent in their captivity. It's persistent. Rapper KANYE West caused an uproar last year when he said something about it, and it was on the tabloid news website TMZ. It went viral. Have a look.
You hear about slavery for 400 years. For 400 years, that sounds like a choice. Like, you was there for 400 years and it's all of y'all?
So Ibrahima, I'll give that one back to you. A choice.
I'm looking for Kanye West. I always ask people if they meet him, tell him I want to meet him at the Whitney plantation so we can have a discussion.
An open invitation, Kanye.
Yeah, please. And we'll have a very, frank and...
What would you tell him? Because I know there's people in our audience, I'm sure, people who are watching who might think similarly.
I would tell him what I tell to visitors when they come to the Whitney plantation, no matter the color of the skin or whatever, it is about understanding slavery and why it happened and why it lasted so long. It was a system very well organized and people fought against it. Personally, before I forget, I would like to compare what Charles Delon did and his followers compared with what George Washington and Thomas Jefferson did with the Revolutionary War. They wanted to be free and they succeeded. These people too wanted to build a free nation, but they did not succeed. But that was the goal. Yeah, let's remember that. But unfortunately, in this country and everywhere, there is so much glorification, and the people don't really go deep into the real history of the people and tell them the truth. Unfortunately, in this country, we have too much hidden history. And
yeah, exactly. It's not even just modern history, too, because this information, days after the revolt failed, this information was deliberately suppressed and deliberately minimized. Governor William C.C. Claiborne, who was the governor of the Orleans Territory at the time, the American governor, that is, he actually gave a talk to some prominent French planters, after the revolt had failed. And everybody was expecting him to talk about this huge slave revolt that had just happened. And instead, he just talked about how the Americans had recently annexed Spanish West Florida, so basically where Baton Rouge is today. And all he talked about, the only mention of the slave revolt in that speech, in that talk, essentially kind of a 19th century press conference, right, was he said, oh, the bandits, they've been, we took care of them. It was just a small little insurrection. Don't worry yourself about it. It's all in hand.
And one of the things I'd like to bring up about that, Andrew, is that the story is still being suppressed. I mean, until Whitney Plantation came about, and still now,
yes.
the narrative is still that where the enslavers were the poor victims of this this rebellion, and that's what this event, the 1811 reenactment, was about, is changing that narrative.
Yes,
and if
absolutely.
you say to these plantations that, these people didn't have a right to want their freedom, they would say something like, well, but he was a good master. He didn't beat his slaves.
Yeah,
and that's today.
Absolutely.
That's today.
I want to jump in here on that and the sanitizing of the history here because it's happened so thoroughly. So I want to share a picture, this from Dr. Stephen Thrasher at the Whitney Plantation. He says, this is horrifying and haunting, and I'm going to scroll down here so you can see it, but here it still looks sanitized because it looks like statues. So I'm going to give you a closer look. Now, the Whitney Museum has a permanent exhibit to honor the 1811 rebellion. It includes dozens of ceramic heads, which you saw here in this tweet, and they're mounted on spikes, and it depicts what happened to some of the revolutionaries after the rebellion. This, a clip from your documentary, Andrew. I want all of our audience to have a look at this.
Claiborne and the planters decided to make an example of the rebels. 100 slaves were decapitated and their heads set on pikes for 40 miles along River Road, from the Woodland Plantation all the way to the Place d'Armes in the heart of the French Quarter.
What was the idea behind this? I mean, I think it's clear, but I want to hear from you. To scare people off?
No, not to scare people off. I think
from doing it again, from revolting and rebelling again.
Oh, you mean the purpose? Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, yes, it was untrammeled violence, which was the only language that the planter class really understood. And one of the things that I wanted to make very clear in this documentary is, this, obviously, that if you see that sculpture, that piece of art, that memorial in person, it is absolutely chilling. And you take that image and you imagine all those heads on pikes for 40 miles on the levee, extending into, the Place d'Armes, as I said, which is today Jackson Square. So the place where you see newlyweds taking their photographs, you see, a nice pleasant fountain and everybody running around having a great time, people having picnics. in winter and spring of 1811, if you had been in Jackson Square, you would have seen the skulls of these slave rebels rotting on these pikes. It was absolutely medieval. And people, I think, I mean, it was absolutely brutal, and people should know this. They should know that Americans did this, that we took these medieval measures to suppress an entire group of people. That was the whole thing, is they were making an example out of them. They wanted to discourage them from doing it again.
Yeah, I would like to jump in there and pay homage to Woodrow Nash, who did the sculptures of the ceramic heads. You know, that memorial on Whitney Plantation is very criticized. Some people say they didn't want to be represented like that, dead, and the head posted on poles. They wanted to be seen in a position of resistance, like with a big statue like those we can see in Haiti. And also at the same time, people criticize what Dred Scott did, the celebration on Congo Square. Some people say it shouldn't end like that. They wanted something.
You can't please everybody, right? Yeah.
No, you cannot satisfy everybody. I think each one has to do something. We need to have everyone who can to do something, you know. But nothing is
both
perfect.
are valid approaches, I think. Yeah, I mean, I think the Whitney Plantation has done a fantastic job of really emphasizing the horror of slavery and the utter tragedy of slavery and this event. But I also think that Dred Scott's reenactment, had some value, ending in a celebration, ending in an alternate history. I think it just makes, I think it makes people, just kind of be more proud of this and think, what could have been? We were so close, and this fight for freedom is so close.
It's a little deeper than that. It's a little bit more spiritual. It's more about choosing to have a celebration in honor of those who did die, who did march, who maybe survived. But for all of those who have marched on or struggled through slavery, we celebrated their lives. We celebrated their resistance. We celebrated all that they have given us and brought down to us. And we wanted to uplift them. Just like we participate in Civil War reenactments, and we honor Thomas Jefferson and all of those guys, we should honor Charles Deslon and those who marched in the 1811 revolt.
KAIA, I want to share a video comment from someone who was part of that honoring. This is Jason Ludwig. He's a PhD student at Cornell University, but he was there at the reenactment. And this is what he tells the stream about what this means for us today. Have a listen.
It's important to note that Dred Scott chose to restage a rebellion that took place in what is today St. John the Baptist Parish, Louisiana. Once home to the plantations that fueled the growth of King Cotton, today this parish sits at the heart of what's known as Cancer Alley, a concentration of petrochemical plants that every day emits tons of toxic chemicals into largely low-income black communities. By marching 500 reenactors through this space, the performance summons the ghosts of the past to show us how the historical violences of slavery still make their presence felt today in modern injustices.
IBRAHIMA, there's so much more to talk about, but we're running out of time. And so in the last minute of our show, picking up on that video comment, what are the lessons that we should take with us today from this rebellion? Yeah,
I just want to say we still have a long way to go for social justice. And what I would like to say before we leave is about the celebration on Congo Square. I was among the people who marched to the Congo Square, and I did not feel myself as Ibrahim SECK, marching on Congo Square, but it was me, Charles Delonde, or Amaro Komina, getting to finally to Congo Square with triumph. That's what I saw. It was those people who finally made it in the heart of New Orleans, and that's really important. And all the people who saw us marching on the levees, marching through the French Quarter into Congo Square, we'll go ahead and learn something about slavery and what is going on right now.
I have to pause you there. That's all the time we have for now. Thank you to all of our guests for being part of this, to our community as well. And you can check out AJ Plus on Instagram for more on this. Next week, they'll have more details about the rebellion. We will see you online.